The Western world is in dire need of chemotherapy, for it has a cancer known as individualism. Every action has a consequence. If you go around punching people in the face, then you probably shouldn't be too surprised if you eventually get punched yourself. In the last episode, I spoke of how the bourgeoisie punched Western society in the face by betraying the workers of their nations in numerous ways in order to enrich themselves. But in this episode, I'll be showing you some of the consequences of such a betrayal, and how the bourgeoisie's greed has resulted in the creation of a new type of disturbing individual, the likes of which now haunts us all on a daily basis. And don't say I didn't warn you that this would be depressing. This is the second threat known as the decadent. Oh, but first, I need to dress for the occasion. Much better. Let me ask you a question. What is the difference between a monkey and a human? On the surface, not much actually. We both look similar, both having 2 hands to pick with, 2 legs to move with, 2 eyes to see with, 2 ears to hear with, and a mouth to smile with. Aww. We both even act similar as well, mutually liking to eat, drink, and sleep. Indeed, there seems to be much in common with us and our primate friends in the animal kingdom, but of course, we are also very different. If you gave a monkey a bunch of bananas and left them in a jungle, they'd be satisfied. But if you did the same to a human, we most certainly wouldn't be. On the contrary, the human being, unlike the monkey, would start to tame the jungle, manipulating our reality in order to accommodate us better. This is because, unlike the monkey, we human beings have been blessed with a brain like no other. And through this mental blessing, we have been gifted numerous abilities. We are creative, conjuring jaw-dropping works of art. We are questioning, always pondering the reality around us. And we are inventive, making grandiose machines that make our lives easier. Such as the very device you're watching this on right now. If you were an alien who visited Earth to analyse our planet's species, you probably wouldn't be too impressed with the monkeys. But with us humans, our mark on planet Earth is simply everywhere, and even beyond. A monkey could never build a rocket and get to the moon, but we can, and did. It's clear then that the mental prowess that we humans have been gifted is something very special indeed. And, as stated earlier, makes us stand out from the rest of the other species on our planet. However, at our physical core, it is undeniable that a certain animalism still lingers on within human beings, as despite all our collective accomplishments and achievements, we are all fundamentally engaged in a constant struggle. A struggle against decadence. The word decadence means many different things to many different people, but to me, ultimately represents the struggle between what man is and what man could be. Decadence ultimately means to overrule our long-term intelligent thinking and act on one's short-term animalistic impulses instead. It is a disease of the mind whereby everyone is susceptible, turning us from the humans we should be into acting like animals, becoming slaves to our instincts, emotions, and savagery. For example, a man is hungry and wants some food. Does he A. spend time to cook himself a nice healthy meal, or B. lazily sit on his backside and get some fast food delivered instead? If he has low decadence, he'll intelligently value his long-term health. Whereas if he has high decadence, he'll foolishly value his short-term laziness instead. Another example, a married man starts getting flirted with by a single woman who he finds attractive. Does he A. reject the woman and stay loyal to his wife? Or B. flirt back and cheat on his wife? If he has low decadence, he'll intelligently value his long-term family unit. Whereas if he has high decadence, he'll foolishly value his short-term lust instead. A final example. A recovering alcoholic woman is offered some beer by a friend. Does she A. reject the offer to maintain her progress? Or B. let her hair down and embrace the poison? If she has low decadence, she'll intelligently value her long-term recovery. Whereas if she has high decadence, she'll foolishly value her short-term cravings instead. In all three of these examples, the people with low decadence would go on to make decisions that, in the short term, go against their natural impulses, but in the long term would intelligently prove to be the right move. The hungry man would have a healthy meal, positively affecting his health. The married man would stay loyal to his wife, keeping his family unit together. And the alcoholic woman would continue her recovery until she's fully cured. But meanwhile, the people with high decadence all went on to make decisions that, in the short term, aligned with their natural impulses, but in the long term would only go on to hurt them. The hungry man would eat junk, negatively affecting his health. The married man would cheat on his wife, putting his entire family unit at risk. And the alcoholic woman would drink the beer, spiraling back into alcoholism. Proving the mantra of wisdom that just because you can, probably doesn't mean you should. It should be noted, however, that decadence is not a binary yes or no, a 0 or 1, an off or on. It is a spectrum, whereby everyone, to an extent, is likely at least somewhat decadent in some regard. Because as stated earlier, we are all, as human beings, constantly undergoing a struggle of man versus animal. What classifies someone as an actual outright decadent, however, is whether they have engaged in so much negative behaviour that it has become so normalised in their psyche that it is now almost impossible for them to act otherwise. Which brings us back to today. As stated in the last episode, the consequences of globalization was absolutely devastating for those affected, as the loss of such resource gathering and manufacturing jobs, many of which were held for generations within certain families, was incredibly sudden and crippling. The victims of globalization were affected in two main ways, the first being the more obvious one of financially. It somewhat goes without saying that being made suddenly redundant obviously has negative material implications. No longer being able to afford not just luxury products or services, but even the bare bones basics. And secondly, psychologically. As jobs, contrary to popular belief, are more than just a means of getting money. As for a lot of people, it also gives them a purpose, especially for men. And the loss of such purpose would go on to permeate a feeling of uselessness and failure amongst those affected, a feeling that would often not be remedied. In response to such a large swath of people suddenly being made financially and psychologically vulnerable, the bourgeoisie would be forced to agree to implement welfare schemes in order to keep societal peace. Thus, such redundant people, rather than being retrained for alternative employment, would instead be lazily given scraps of cash to stay alive. Then, they would be left to their own devices, only to be completely and utterly starved of opportunities for improvement. The once thriving manufacturing hubs of the Western world would suddenly become dominated by giant artificial reservations for the poor, whereby the nation's most deprived people would artificially be isolated from the rest of society and left to rot in scandalous conditions. Rather than spreading out such disaffected people across society at large until they inevitably regained their foothold, they were instead all congregated together. Which, needless to say, was not a very good idea. In Britain, we called these places council estates, whereas in America, they called them ghettos. But whatever you call them, one thing's for certain, and that's that within these newfound places of misery, a new decadent culture would slowly start to formulate. Imagine growing up in a place whereby everyone you know is poor, desperate, and sad. This environment, forging a mind during its most early years, will inevitably result in disaster. Hence, the birth of the decadent. Let's go for a drive. Think of the journey of life like taking a drive on the motorway. There's many different twists and turns you can take, and what ones you do will ultimately determine your final destination. Believe it or not, there's an alternative universe where I, you, and anyone could have been a decadent. But most of us don't end up that way, because we have numerous opportunities that allow us to escape such a terrible fate. But the issue with this newfound underclass is that they have almost zero opportunities of any kind. Thus, their path, barring miracles, is seemingly set in stone. a life of almost guaranteed decadence. Depressing drive. Now, across much of the Western world, are little pockets of what can only be described as absolute shame. Uneducated, demoralised and decayed people with absolutely nothing going for them whatsoever. And because such people know that they have zero long-term opportunities of any kind, many don't even bother trying to make something of themselves. Instead, choosing to simply engage in constant short-term thrills such as alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, unhealthy food, and recreational intercourse. AKA decadence. The United States of America claims to be the world's most wealthiest nation. At the time of recording, the USA does factually have the world's largest gross domestic product. But that is really nothing more than a statistic, as in reality, that wealth has in recent decades become so unevenly distributed that it's almost hard to fathom. Today, in practically every major American city, cheap, addictive, and dangerous drugs have been allowed to reap havoc upon America's poorest people, who are so drugged up that they almost resemble zombies. Interestingly, the American bourgeoisie are too busy trying to divide their people against each other to notice. Black versus white, male versus female, young versus old. And yet, when one looks at those at the bottom of American society, one can't help but notice people from all walks of life. Though they are all certainly united in one way, and that's that they're all poor. Women sleeping on concrete. Sleeping alone in the streets. What if this was your daughter? Or what about this? Every single American watching this should ask themselves, did your ancestors emigrate across oceans, fight in many bloody wars, and work to build your nation, only for it to become a place whereby your countrymen are left to wander around, coked up in the streets? No. This is an embarrassing vista for the so-called wealthiest country on earth, and an absolute disgrace upon the American people. Not that Britain is doing much better either. According to the Office of National Statistics, in 1971, less than 10% of live births in England and Wales were performed by unmarried parents. But 50 years later in 2021, and this number had increased by more than 5 times to over 50% of the entire population. Meaning that there are now more overall unmarried couples giving birth than married couples. And you'll notice that this massive upward spiral all started directly after globalization. And you can see this very clearly by how an increasing amount of young men, rather than desiring to be a good husband, father, and citizen, are instead only obsessed with losing their virginities. And likewise with an increasing amount of young women who, rather than valuing themselves by guarding their bodies in chastity, are instead prone to giving themselves away. Over the course of just a handful of generations, this newfound decadent culture within such neglected environments has resulted in a status quo within such places, whereby hardly anyone has a father, and single motherhood is rife. And because of such a lack of parental oversight, terrible crimes such as rape are sadly all too common against the youth who grow up in such environments. As showcased in towns such as Rotherham in England, whereby gangs of child molesters were allowed to run rampant for years, with very little justice being served due to the victims being poor. An absolute disgrace. Sadly, this trend is also seen when we look at the rate of deaths relating to alcohol, whereby one can't help but notice that it's the places that were the most affected by globalization, such as the north of England, that by far have the most deaths. And likewise, when it comes to deaths by drugs as well. Unfortunately, though living in such environments increases the chance of becoming a victim, it also increases the chances of becoming a victimizer. As many people who grow up in such environments, specifically young men, are often prone to forming gangs, who go on to sadistically terrorize their local communities, and sometimes beyond, by dominating innocence as a showcase of directionless strength. It's no secret that the crime rate amongst Western youths has gone absolutely through the roof in recent years, whether it be gun violence, knife crime, or even just bare-bones brawling. The kinds of terrible feral acts that many young people do to each other today would have been completely unthinkable just a few decades ago. In my little corner of England, you genuinely cannot step outside for longer than 5 minutes without experiencing something akin to the following encounter.
Oi. Oi, you.
Me?
Yeah, you. What do you think you're looking at?
Oh, I'm just waiting for the buzz.
You think you're hard, do you? Eh?
Sorry?
Listen, mate. Right, listen here. If you look at me like that again, I swear on me mum, I will send you packing to Kingdom Come! Do you understand me?
What? Oversized baggy tracksuit? Check. An obsession with shoe brands? Check. Splurging graffiti absolutely everywhere? Check. Probably owns one of these things? Check. Always aimlessly hanging outside of a McDonald's at 2 o'clock in the morning for no reason whatsoever? Check. Ladies and gentlemen, the average aggressive decadent.
You think you're hard, do you? Huh? You think you're hard?
But as easy as it is to look down on the decadents and mock them for their poor behaviour, when I see such people, I truly see nothing more than a tragedy. As these people, in another time, under different circumstances, could have been someone positive. Unfortunately, as stated last episode, the left-wing movements who were made to prevent this scenario from happening in the first place were successfully taken over by the bourgeoisie, who are now much too concerned with putting a rainbow flag on every street corner instead. In fact, on the contrary, the bourgeoisie of such nations actually started to take advantage of such a situation by trying to make a business out of it. In the UK, this would take place in the form of mockery. Shows, such as the Jeremy Kyle Show, would seemingly artificially seek out Britain's poorest and most questionable individuals, known as chavs, or council-housed and violent, whereby they'd then be publicly humiliated by airing their dirty laundry on national TV, essentially making an industry of entertainment from desperate people's misery. Not gonna lie though, it was a pretty damn good show. But that's nothing compared to what happened in the United States, where, while they of course had similar such shows, they would take it even one step further, actually glamorizing decadence via the use of movies, video games, and especially music, inspiring future generations of poor, young, and angry people, rather than ascending out of such terrible lifestyles, to instead embrace them. Go back and look at the lyrics from tunes of the past, and you'll find that it was mostly very positive, romantic, and quaint. A far stretch from today, whereby they're typically negative, hateful, and yes, decadent, with rap music being by far the most intentionally subverted genre. Whereas people used to look up to somewhat respectable figures, such as spiritual icons, historical figures, and revered statesmen, now they idolize artificial celebrities who intentionally promote careless lifestyles. Today, the men and women who act decently and treat others respectfully are seen as foolish, whereas those who selfishly act in their own interests and manipulate others for their own gain are seen as legendary. A complete and utter cultural inversion, the likes of which has never been seen in human history. The celebration, not of long-term intelligent planning, but short-term selfish indulgence, aka decadence. Now let me make this very clear. If you're watching this rolling your eyes thinking that I'm just stating the obvious about the fact that some people are poor and deprived, so let's get out the tissue box, then you've completely missed the point. As throughout history, there has always been people who are down on their luck, as, by definition, in order for there to be winners, there must also be losers. But the issue with these newfound decadents is that their lack of economic opportunities and subsequent decadent culture was not naturally conjured, but was artificially created. It's not as if the creation of the decadent was intentional, mind, part of some top-secret classified master plan. No, merely the result of an individualistic bourgeoisie who simply didn't care enough about their collective society. But now that they do exist, such a corrupt status quo is almost certainly being fostered intentionally. And rather than fix the terrible conditions that the bourgeoisie themselves have created, they have instead chosen to enrich themselves off the suffering of their victims even further, by making such a lifestyle seem celebratory and even desirable. The 10 reasons why drinking beer is good for your health. Really? If you want to know the attitude of at least one member of the Western bourgeoisie on decadence, then you need only look at ex-British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who wrote in the Telegraph newspaper back in 2005, "The bottom 1/5 of British citizens supplies us with the chavs, the losers, the burglars, the drug addicts, and the 70,000 people who are lost in our prisons, learning nothing except how to become more effective criminals." I admittedly like quotes such as this, as it proves that much of the bourgeoisie have almost zero mental understanding that the decadents didn't just spawn out of thin air, but that they were made. And not only that, but they made them. But would you believe me if I said that it was actually possible to be both bourgeoisie and a decadent at the same time? A rare phenomenon known as bourgeoisie decadence. This is where the bourgeoisie, or more commonly, the sons and daughters of them, will take on the artificially promoted style of decadence in the media as their own, whereby, despite technically being from millionaires, they will pretend as if they are some sort of hard-done-by gangsters and act as such. Indeed, the decadents can't even have their own suffering without being appropriated by the bourgeoisie. Nevertheless, bourgeoisie decadence, though annoying, is ultimately just a sideshow. The real issue at hand is the fact that the decadent underclass not only exists, but is allowed to continue to wallow in their own misery. Clearly, something should be done about this. But what? Well, if it's true that such decadents were spawned from a lack of economic opportunities and the subsequent decadent culture that spawned from it, then the priority for society should be thus to implement the exact opposite. To introduce economic opportunities for those at the bottom of society, but also the complete and utter elimination of such a decadent culture. To briefly list some techniques that could be done. A mass demolition project of ghettos, preventing decadent culture from being able to form en masse. The abolition of private education, forcing the bourgeoisie to invest in the public sector. The promotion of positive media, taking the place of intentionally negative influences. Professional rehabilitation, training those who committed forgivable crimes with a profession to get them back into society. The return of the death penalty, given to those who commit unforgivable crimes against humanity in order to send a clear message of order. And active measures, taking steps to prevent crimes from happening in the first place by having militarized police patrols in high crime areas. Now, going in depth on each one of these techniques really requires a production in of itself, but if there's one thing I want you to take away from this production, it's this. Of course, decadence, being an eternal struggle of man versus animal, will never truly go extinct. After all, Earth is not heaven, and never will be. But we in the Western world must really stop pretending that the intentional creation of decadence in our society isn't a big deal. It is. For there has never in the entirety of human history been such a disloyal group of leaders than our bourgeoisie, who have allowed their own citizens to devolve into such a decayed state. Western society at large must start to begin the transformation of such people from their current decayed state into upstanding citizens immediately. Because, fueled by innovations such as AI, as wealth continues to consolidate in the hands of a few, we can only expect decadence to absolutely skyrocket as more and more people begin to get in a financial pinch. And at such a point, if left unchecked, decadence won't just affect the bottom rungs of society, but everyone except the bourgeoisie. Whereby then, the state of the world as we know it would be beyond dire. Is the future of humanity to collectively unite, empowering everyone as best we can, venturing out into space, evolving to become a true multistellar species? Or is our fate instead to individualistically allow the bourgeoisie to dominate ad infinitum, while the rest of humanity slithers away, slowly devolving us all into surrendering to our inner animalism? This is an existential threat for humanity. So at this point you're probably wondering, why has there been no efforts to overthrow the bourgeoisie and prevent this spiral of decadency from carrying on? And that would be a good question. A question that will be answered in the next and final episode, whereby I'll be showcasing the third threat, who is the type of person with a mindset that prevents true change from ever occurring. And they, as a result, are my least favourite threat of them all.